A question that most of us struggle with on the SAT is that of race. The first question asks us if we're Hispanic, and we select yes. Then comes the tricky part. Please indicate your race. Yeah, that's the tough one. Whether you're Boricua, Mexicano, Centroamericano, or Sudamericano. This question is challenging. Do I pick black, white, indigenous? Probably not Pacific Islander. Maybe Asian? Or do I select multiple? And the answer to this question is that it depends on each individual situation. In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the importance in understanding the difference between race and ethnicity. ¿Qué onda? Soy Sebastián y este podcast es Otomí. For all of my non-Spanish native speakers, this is Sebastian, and I'm a high school student in the Bay Area. I've got the facts and the opinions. Join me as we discuss topics of society, culture, identity, education, and life. Prior to jumping into our topic, I'd like to set some definitions right now of some terms that I'll be using. To start off, I want to make the distinction between race and ethnicity. Race is usually associated with physical features, biological physical features that come from genetic information. On the other hand, ethnicity is linked with cultural expression and identity. And that's important because I know that for a lot of Latinos, it's difficult to really see the difference between those two because we often identify more with our ethnicity than we do with our race. The reason being that we are so mixed as a population. We are so mixed that we see ourselves as a new race, a race that is separate and has passed that stage of, oh, I'm white, I am Native American, I am African descendant. Some other terms that I'd like to define is the difference between Hispanic and Latino. And I bet that many of you have asked yourself this question. And there's a big distinction. A country that is Hispanic, or an individual who's Hispanic, comes from a country that speaks Spanish, while someone who is Latino comes from Latin America, being a country in the Americas that speaks a Romance language. Now, I'm going to give you some examples to show the difference. A Hispanic can be from Spain, which is in Europe. They could be from Latin America, Mexico, Cuba, or they can be from Africa, Equatorial Guinea, where Spanish is the official language. Then we have Latino, which is very different because in Latin America, they don't just speak Spanish, of course. Of course, we have Brazil, a massive country, the largest one in Latin America, where they speak Portuguese. That is in Latin America because Portuguese is a Romance language. Then we have Haiti, where they speak French, which is another Romance language. So there's another Latin American country. And those are just examples. We have Spain, which is Hispanic and not Latino. And then we have a Brazilian who would be Latino, but not Hispanic. So it's important to know the distinction between those two terms. I'm going to start by kind of giving you some background information about who I am and how this question about identity has impacted me. So to start off, I'm just going to lay out my culture, my heritage has impacted how I see myself racially. So we'll start with my mother. My mom, she is Mexican. Both her parents are Mexican. They've been in Mexico for many generations. So she's entirely Mexican. And my father is He's actually of mixed heritage. He was born in Geneva, Switzerland. His father is Swiss, and his mother is Spanish. She's from Salamanca, Spain. Well, Fuente Sauco. Now, where does the question of race come into play? The truth is that I've always identified more with my Hispanic side, since I'm 3/4 Hispanic. My father is half Spanish, therefore he's Hispanic, and my mother is entirely Hispanic. So I feel like I've been more exposed to my Hispanic side of the family. And for that reason, I identify more with them. It's not only that, but I also feel like there's a phenotypic aspect to it as well. And also the language that I learned when I was being raised. My father speaks Spanish, French, and English. My mother speaks Spanish and English. And the first language that I learned along with English was Spanish. I consider both English and Spanish to be my two native languages because they're the ones that I learned just when I was a small child. So in this memoir of mine, we were going to the College and Career Center at my school for a meeting with like our college counselors. We went as a class. I don't remember what class I was in, but we went and we were becoming familiar with this college connections interface called Naviance. And we were there as a class. I was looking at my profile and I noticed that it said white for me. I was very confused because I didn't see how I could fall into this categorization completely. Yes, my dad's white, but just even though I'm Latino, it doesn't mean I should be white. I called over one of the counselors and I said, this doesn't make sense. Here it says I'm white. And she said, what? Okay, then what do you want it to say? And I said, I want it to say Hispanic, Latino. And she said, yeah, but that's not ethnic. That's not your race. That's your ethnicity. And also, she was Latina, the person who I was talking to, my counselor. She wasn't my counselor. She was one of the counselors there. And she was Latina. She said, yeah, I'm Latina. And they make me write down that I'm white. And I was so confused. I said, you have the same amount of melanin on your arm as me. We're not white. When I look at the mirror, I don't completely see a white person. Yes, I have some physical features that may be attributed to a Caucasian individual, but I also have some that are not. So I'm not going to make the 100% dedication to saying that my identity is that of a white Caucasian individual. And this is what really sparked the question, because I was like, she said, what are you going to put down as your race then? And he said, I wasn't too sure. I said, Native American. That was also back when I was, the categorizations, I wasn't too sure because I said, well, being part Aztec, part whatever indigenous Mexican I am, because back then I wasn't too cognizant of the fact that I'm a direct descendant of the Otomí. I just knew I had some indigenous percentage in me because of how my grandfather looks, as well as my mother is darker. She's dark skinned. She's a morena, and I'm a moreno too. So I was like, there's no way I'm 100% European. Not that I have anything against Europeans. I just said there's no way that this could be the case. And this is one of those things that really sparked my interest. I'm going to talk about the big racial populations that are at least present within Latin America, which I'd say is the center point of racial mixing in all the world. We will start with the Spanish, who came and conquered and created their empire. The Europeans, basically. Then we have the white people. Then we have the Native Americans, who were there before, of course, the conquerors came. Then we have the Asian people, many who immigrated especially to Peru and Brazil. And then we have the Africans, who were enslaved and brought against their will. So I just want to outline that just because you're Hispanic doesn't mean you're mestizo. I'm going to right now identify the different terms that are used for racial groups. Because in Latin America, there's so much mixing, it's not just, you can't just say, oh, he's black, he's white, he's indigenous. It doesn't work like that. So I'll lay them out. Mestizo is a term used for individuals who are of mixed descent, Spanish and indigenous. Then we have mulatto, which comes from half African and half white. And then there are other subsections such as, I believe it's sambo, which I believe that these terms are starting to become seen as derogatory. So I don't use them, of course, in my daily speech. It's just for educative purposes, I'm going to be saying them now, which is, it was used for individuals who are of African and native descent. The reason, I'm going to give you a layout right now of why I don't say mulatto, especially since I know that it's definitely considered derogatory in the United States. I had a conversation with my English teacher because in Mexico, it still seems to be used a lot. It's not really seen as much as a derogatory term, but my grandfather, he told me this, the reason why I shouldn't use it. And it's because, so mulatto, do you know what the word mula comes from? Mula means mule. And if you know what a mule is, it's a hybrid between a donkey and a horse. So clearly I would consider it to be somewhat offensive to give that name to an individual, basically comparing them to animals. That's why I'm very opposed to that. So of course, when it comes to me talking about my race, who I am, I identify a lot of the time with, I'm Hispanic. I used to identify as Mexican, but no, I knew that I had to find out more. And I saw that I was mestizo because I'm saying, how am I going to have this melanin in my skin if I am 100% white? It's not possible. So I really started to look into it. I did some research. I asked my mom. I asked my grandpa, and I said, Tito, that's what I call him. Tito, what is my ethnicity? Because my grandpa, Tito, he's dark-skinned. He is of indigenous descent. His grandfather was a member of the Otomí community. It's a little larger than I'd say a tribe, but he is a member of that community, and he identifies with it. He's someone who was just like me, fascinated in who he was and his race and his culture and his heritage. And he even hired, I believe, some family historians to look back to see who we are as people. And he knows that his grandfather is Otomí because my great-grandfather, his father, taught him many words in that language. My grandpa's grandfather, he spoke fluent Otomí. He didn't really speak any Spanish. And that's where I really know my descent and my lineage. And I've always had this trouble identifying with it just because in the United States, I believe there's some standard of having to have some sort of certificate of tribal affiliation. And it seems as though most of the benefits, most of the scholarships when it comes to indigenous people are reserved for individuals who have tribal affiliations with the United States, even though Latin America has significantly higher populations of Native Americans than the United States. So now I want to explain the racial makeup of Mexico. In the case that Mexico has an extremely large indigenous population. Now, Mexico doesn't have the highest percentage of indigenous people in Latin America. The country with the highest percentage is Bolivia, which has a population of a percentage of 62% indigenous people. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, indigenous people compose 31% of Mexico's total population, but they have by far the highest number of indigenous people at 17 million people. Then we have mestizos, which according to that same graphic, they compose around 62% of the population. I've seen some graphics that literally categorize mestizos as 95% of the population, which could be true because in the end, in Mexico, there's so much mixing that the majority of people do have a certain level of African, European, and indigenous blood. The thing with the one that has the mestizo graphic where it says 95%, most likely it's considering people who are predominantly European, predominantly African, predominantly indigenous. Because when you say 31% indigenous, those are, at least in the point of view of the Encyclopedia Britannica, that is the majority of the people in the country. That 31% is people with largely predominant indigenous blood, which is something we don't see anywhere else. Then another thing I'd like to share is that, so if there's 31% that is indigenous, 62% that's mestizo, and 7% left. There's 7% left that is neither mestizo or indigenous. 1% of that population is black, predominantly black. Of course, just like I said before, the majority of Mexicans have African DNA in them. A lot of people don't want to accept this, but it's true. There were 200,000 slaves that were brought to Mexico, and they were brought to Veracruz, and they spread through the population. They settled, and now they have higher populations in Guerrero and Oaxaca. But in the average Mexican has a somewhat small amount of African blood, maybe 8%, 5%, 8%, 10%. But it's still there. And a lot of these European countries, a lot of these Latin American countries have triracial populations, especially in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, they have the Taino, who are the native peoples of Puerto Rico, because the Boricua, which are the people from Puerto Rico, they are probably the majority of the people are triracial, with significant percentages in each of the three racial categories that the majority of them are in, which is indigenous, Taino, the indigenous group of that island. Then we have the African slaves, which there were many African slaves who went to Puerto Rico. And then we have, finally, the Europeans, the Spaniards who were there. And there are a lot of people in Puerto Rico who are white as well, or predominantly white, and have a phenotype resembling an individual who is European. But nonetheless, that country, just like the rest of Latin America, has a lot of diversity. And the thing that's interesting is, yes, the majority of the people in these countries have black, they have white, they have indigenous blood, but there's just so much diversity in the percentage of each. Although the majority of people do have that, there are people who have 30% African, 30% indigenous, and then you've got people, and then say 40% white. Then you have people who are like, they have 2% African, 3% indigenous, and 95% white, and they're going to look completely white. Some people are 100% black. And that's just because there's a lot of diversity. And the thing is they're not recent immigrants. These are individuals who came from a lineage, and they have inherited a social status that has been the result of centuries of slavery, conquest, and oppression. Now, another reason why I actually identify more with my Mexican side of the family than my father's Spanish and Swiss European side of the family is simply because of my phenotype and my appearance. People, of course, in an ideal world that wouldn't matter, but in terms of identity and how you identify, the percent of your blood quantum saying you're part white and part Native American, it's not analogous with your phenotype and how much of that is present. Now, I have a perfect example basically in my family. My brother Andre, his phenotype resembles much more that of a European Caucasian individual, where he has a narrower nose. He has straighter hair, and he has thinner lips. On the contrary, I have larger lips than him. My nose is wider. I have darker skin. He's paler. And I don't have any problem with that. You know, they call me, my family, I'm the morenito, which means like the brown skin. And then my brother is the güerito, which means he's like the white boy. And that I'm fine with that. And that's why I identify more, because when I see my grandfather, I see myself. And likewise, that's probably a reciprocal reaction. He probably, when he sees me, he sees himself within me. We have wider noses, we have darker skin, and those are our stature. We're built pretty similarly. My brother's built more like my father, who's leaner. A lot of people don't think we're brothers. They don't believe it, simply because they believe we're different races. They think my brother's white. They think I'm Hispanic or Latino, stereotypical Latino, which, as we've debunked today, is not really the case, because there's so much diversity within the Hispanic community. You couldn't just say that man is a Latino and that's his race. His race is being Latino. That would be inaccurate, because being Latino is an ethnicity, not a race. But basically the idea is that when they see me, they see a mestizo. When they see my brother, they see this just almost purely European individual, regardless if they know he's Latino or white or just non-Latino, non-Hispanic white. So an example of a situation that exemplifies this idea of my appearance, racial appearance, impacting the way that, you know, people will treat me is with there was a teacher who I had who was a physics teacher. I'm not going to give any names out, but he called me Pablo in class, you know, Pablo. And he was a white teacher, and he called me Pablo. And because I was raising my hand, I was going to ask him a question for the physics class. This was in my sophomore year. And he said, "Yeah, Pablo, your question." And I was like, "My name's not Pablo." And everyone else laughed, and I also laughed too. I thought it was funny. I'm like, why is he calling me Pablo? And then he's like, "Wait, so you're not Pablo? Who's Pablo?" The real Pablo in the class, because there was a Pablo. It's not like he just made up the name and called me Pablo. There's another kid called Pablo who's Spanish. He's half American, white American, half Spanish. And he is like extremely white. He has super pale skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair. So then my teacher, he said, "That doesn't make sense. Why is the white guy named Pablo and not the Hispanic looking one?" And I was like, man, everyone was just looking at us, and it was so awkward. And I think he realized he made a mistake, because then he tried to laugh it off. And I think he called me Pablo again just as a joke. And I was like, "Dude, stop right now. What are you doing?" But yeah, that was actually kind of funny, kind of awkward experience that I had. But it's fine. I feel like those last words that he made, that his last comments about me looking more Hispanic than Pablo, even though Pablo he's half Hispanic, so he's Hispanic as well, demonstrates that ignorance of what being Hispanic constitutes. Being Hispanic has nothing to do with your race. It has to do with your culture, the language you speak. Okay, Pablo doesn't speak Spanish, but still, his father speaks Spanish. His father's from Spain. He is descendant of an individual who's Hispanic. So he has inherited that Hispanic identity. Now, I want to make some comments on some stereotypical or common occurrences that I've seen that are, I think, a result of a lack of knowledge with regards to the difference between race and ethnicity, as well as just as a lack of knowledge in the racial groups in general. My first example is there's this friend who I have who identifies as being a member of the Choctaw Native American tribe here in the United States. He claims to be 2/16, I'm quoting him there, 2/16 Native American, making him a member. And if you're listening to this, you know who you are, but I'm not going to make any direct comments about who you are. But I bet you will remember this. We were taking our PSAT, and right after he told me, yeah, I'm so happy that I could put down I'm Native American. I'm going to get all these benefits. I'm like, you're putting down Native American? Okay, fine. You say that you have this ancestry, so I'm going to respect it. You're 2/16, you're 1/8. And I put down Native American too. I'm like, I also put down Native American, so what's up? And he's just like, you can't put down that you're Native American because you are Mexican. And I was just shocked. I was like, are you kidding me? Are you saying I can't be Native American because I'm Mexican? Have you been to Mexico? Other than those resorts you go to every single year, have you been to actual Mexico and seen the actual people? If we are not native, then what are we? And of course, this doesn't apply to every single Mexican, but I mean, it's just plain ignorant to say that because you're Mexican, you can't be native. And again, just like I said before, Mexico has the highest Native American population in all of the Americas, the highest one with the highest number of predominantly Native American people. So it frustrates me when people make comments like that because I'm saying, you with your 1/8, 2/16 Native American you have the audacity to tell me that I can't be Native American when I have so many more features of that racial group than you. You with your light brown hair, your very pale skin, your long nose, your green eyes, all of these things that I'm basically closer to the opposite of. Black hair, wider nose, darker skin, brownish, blackish eyes. It just shocks me that people could say stuff like that. And of course, I'm not accusing him of anything. He's grown over these past few years. This was like a year ago, but still. Comments like that are ignorant and they're frustrating. Now, another thing, common occurrence that I've seen throughout the internet is all these comments about, when a Dominican says that he's not black, I'm black, I'm not black, I'm Dominican, which is something I've, for the last 5 years, seen reoccur a lot of times on the internet. And debates about it. People saying, I'm not black, I can't be, I'm not black, I'm Dominican. And a lot of these people are saying that because they consider the word black to be categorized for African Americans. And they're saying, I'm not black, I'm native, I am Dominican. And the reason is because they want to show that they're distinguishable from the African Americans. They say we may have the same hair and the same skin color, but we are very distinct. We speak a different language. We eat different foods. We have very different cultures, different music. Although they do have the music, and the music has a lot of influences, both from the United States, African American music, and in the Dominican Republic. They have a lot of influences from, in general, in all of Latin America, they have a lot of influences from Africa. So in that manner, I'd say actually the music is somewhat similar when it comes down to the basic components and the elements that make up these styles of music. But that is where it shows that people are not knowledgeable of the difference between ethnicity and race. They say, I can't be black because I am Dominican. That's not the case. You can be black. Yes, we identify as Hispanic, and a white Dominican and a black Dominican, if they look different or similar, a white Mexican and a black Mexican and an indigenous Mexican, they, no matter how different they are, they will identify with their culture. And that is why we have girls in Mexico with blonde hair dancing, wearing indigenous clothing, because it's that part of the culture. The culture is just a mix of so many things from different cultures. And because we talk of the United States as a melting pot, but I'm going to make a statement that I don't believe that the United States is a melting pot. Latin America is a melting pot, because there we actually had the melting occur that led to the mixing of the genetic composition of those countries. That is an actual melting pot where the elementary components are broken down and then reconstructed in a way that creates a different physical appearance for the people and a new identity and unified people of so many different backgrounds. Then we have the United States, which rather than a melting pot, the United States is a mosaic. And what I mean by that is each of the ethnic enclaves, each group decides to remain in its own private sector. And of course, the beauty of the United States is that you can go and experience so many different things. That's largely geographical, the extent to which you can do that. Someone who lives in Wyoming will not have the same opportunities as someone who lives in San Francisco or New York. But nonetheless, what I'm saying is that here in the United States, a lot of those core things about the original cultures are preserved. Immigrants, they preserve their language, they preserve their culture in ways that are much closer to the original state of the culture within its own native country. And this supports that concept of the mosaic, where each individual group remains intact with its group and stays together, sticks together. While in Latin America, these groups weren't really allowed or permitted to coagulate and remain in their own groups and condense. Instead, they had to disperse, and each individual group dissipated into one large, massive group that created a new culture in the Hispanic Latino identity. And that concludes our first episode. Thank you all so much for listening to my first episode. And I look forward to having you all hear the podcast in my next episode that will be coming up.
La, la, la.